Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight to take some time and honor and remember the Holocaust and the Jews who were murdered. My name is Caroline Dykes. I'm one of the pastors here at Gateway Dallas, and we just want to say welcome. Thank you for being here. We have a lovely evening lined up for us tonight, and to start, we have Michelle Wågsjö, who will play the theme song from Schindler's List. Michelle will be followed by Greg Gauntz. Greg is a TKU student, and he will lead us in the Mourner's Kaddish, while 6 candles are lit for the 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. Following that, we will watch an interpretive dance to the song Never Again by Ingredients Dance Company. And again, we just want to say thank you and welcome. It's going to be a lovely evening. Thank you for being here.
So I'm going to be reading the Kaddish verse in Hebrew and then in English. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah be'alam devara churoteh ve'yamlich bachoteh ve'chayachon uve'yamachon uve'chaye dechol bit Yisrael ba'agala uve'ezma kavriv ve'imru amen. Yehe shomei rabbah mevoach leolam ulamea almaya. Yitboach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitrobam v'yitnaseh v'yithadal v'yita'el v'yithala shmei dekudeshva brichu le'ela mikol burchata v'shuthrata tushbechata v'nechmata de'amin ra be'alma ve'imru amin. Yehe shalom al rabba mishamaya ve'chaim alenu ve'el kol Yisrael ve'imru amin. Oseh shalom beromav huseh shalom alenu ve'el kol Yisrael ve'imru amin. Exalted and hallowed be God's great name. In the world which God created according to plan, may God's majesty be revealed in the days of our lifetime, in the life of all Israel, speedily and mentally, to which we say, Amen. Blessed be God's great name to all the eternity. Blessed, praised, honor, exalted, extolled, glorified, adored, lauded be the name of the Holy Blessed One. Blessed all earthly words, or beyond all earthly words and songs of blessings, praise, and comfort, to which we say, Amen. May there be abundant peace from heaven and life for us and all Israel, to which we say, Amen. May the one who creates harmony on high bring peace to us and to all Israel, to which we say, Amen.
They stood in fear, where could they go? They stood so brave, what did they know? On this day, hear us pray, each prayer meant for you. B'yom HaShoah Yikatevu. How could it be the world was blind? Was no one there to make a stand? On this day, hear us pray, our prayers call out to you. B'yom HaShoah Yikatevu. On this day, hear us pray, our prayers call out to you. B'yom HaShoah Yikatevu. Never again, never again, hear our voice tonight. Never again, never again, knowing wrong from right. The years have passed, we still recall. The Spirit left inspires us all. On this day, hear us pray, the flame still burns for you. B'yom HaShoah Yikatevu. On this day, hear us pray, 6 million prayers for you. B'yom HaShoah Yikatevu. On this day, hear us pray, 6 million prayers for you. ביום השואה ייכתבו.
Hello, there we go. I'm so thankful for everyone who's come this evening. We have at Gateway Church a long-standing friendship with the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies. And the Ackerman Center, we work together in picking speakers for this event, and they've made wonderful suggestions throughout the years, and we partner with them. We love them. So we are blessed this evening to have with us one of their board members, Ron Schwarz. Ron is the son of Charles. Charles was a Holocaust survivor from Germany. His father was a hidden child in France for 3.5 years during the war before he escaped to Switzerland, where he lived out the rest of the war. Ron is going to share stories from his family. He has done extensive research throughout Europe, gathering in hundreds of documents from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. He will incorporate parts of those documents in the presentation this evening, and I know you're going to be deeply blessed, and when he's done, he will have time for some Q&A. So would you please make welcome my friend Ron. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Greg. As Greg told you, my name is Ron Schwarz, and I'm here tonight to tell you a story. It's a true story. It's about my father. It's actually a little picture of him from many years ago. His name was Charles, and it's about, so I'm going to tell you about his experience growing up as a Jew in Germany in the 1930s, and his experience and how he survived the war. And also a little bit about his parents, my grandparents, who also survived. They had a very different experience, but what they endured with dealing with the Nazis and being Jews in Germany. So for me, the story starts in 1925 in a town called Ludwigshafen. Ludwigshafen is in Germany. It's about 70 miles south of Frankfurt. And in the 1920s, Ludwigshafen is a growing industrial town. Industry is growing there. There are a lot of jobs there. Germany in the mid-20s is starting to recover from World War I, and a lot of young people are moving there. There's a Jewish population of about 1,400 families in the 1920s, and you can see the picture on the top left and the top right is the synagogue in Ludwigshafen from the 1920s. My grandparents owned a watchmaker shop, jewelry store in Ludwigshafen. This is actually a picture from the 1920s, and you can see on the right, you see that building where that clock is. That was actually the jewelry store. And they lived right across the street in an apartment. And the name of the street is called Prinz-Regentenstrasse, and you'll excuse my German. So my grandparents got married at the beginning of 1925. My father was born the beginning of 1926. When my grandmother was in the hospital, she had just given birth to my father, an ex-employee walked into the jewelry store to talk to my grandfather about coming back to work. Apparently they had a conversation. They agreed he would start work the next Monday. The guy then took out a gun, shot my grandfather in the chest, killing him, shot 2 other employees in the store, did not kill them, injured them, but they were witnesses to the conversation, and then he turned the gun on himself and he killed himself. This is actually the article from the newspaper in Ludwigshafen the next day, and the headline says, "A terrible bloody act, 2 dead and 2 injured on Prinz-Regentenstrasse." I can't imagine what this was like for my grandmother. She's 25 years old. She has an 8-day-old son. She just lost her husband, and she's got a jewelry store to run. I did read through the article. I was really curious for any hints of anti-Semitism, and I'll just tell you, I didn't see anything like that in the article. The article talked about the mental health of the murderer, which sounds like the same conversation that we're still having today about 100 years later. Life goes on. 3 years later, my grandmother meets Oscar Schwarz and marries him. Oscar adopted my father. My father's 3 years old at the time, and Oscar took over the jewelry store. On the far right, that's actually a picture of my father. I don't know how old he is there, maybe 10, 11, 12. And on the left is, this is an address book from Ludwigshafen from the early 1930s. Schwarz, and you can see where that red arrow is, Oscar, and then it has the address, Prinz-Regentenstrasse. Wait, before I do that. So life in Germany is kind of in the mid to late 20s. Things are getting back to normal after the war. Germany's exporting a lot of products. They're really starting to recover, and things are fine kind of until they're not. My father starts going to school, and the next clip you're going to hear, it's going to be my father talking about some of the anti-Semitism he ran into in school.
In the, I don't know about the first year, but certainly in the second, third year, and beyond that, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the school. In other words, the kids called me Saujude, which is German for Jew pig. And I remember that the teacher really didn't take any action. I mean, he was not openly antagonistic towards me, but he certainly made no attempt whatsoever to curb the other children.
So that's my dad. It's a cute little nugget, isn't he? He's not with us anymore. He died in 2007. But I have 5 hours of video testimony of him recording his story. So I have a lot. And I'm not going to make you listen to all 5 hours, so you're welcome. Oh, and I also want to say, you probably hear an accent when he talks, and I just want to tell you, I don't hear it. My brother doesn't hear it. We don't think my father had an accent, but I know everybody else hears it. The one point I want to make about what he said is he's in school. This is before Hitler is even in power. So even before Hitler comes to power, there are still a lot of feelings of antagonism towards Jews and anti-Semitic feelings. So Hitler comes to power in 1933. He gets named Chancellor of Germany. I want to tell you, I think it's important to note, he came to power by purely 100% legal and legitimate means. There was no rebellion, there was no coup, there was no military takeover. Like I said, it was legit. To understand the appeal of Hitler, though, in 1933, you have to understand a little bit about what was happening in Germany at the time. So I told you in the 20s, Germany was starting to recover from World War I. They were starting to do well economically, except when the Depression hit in America in 1929, the US had lent Germany a lot of money to rebuild after World War I. In 1929, the Depression hits, the US is in really tough straits. They want their money back, so they made Germany start repaying the loans. Germany didn't have the money to repay the loans, so they just started printing money in order to pay back the US. Well, what happened was inflation in Germany skyrocketed, like through the roof, to the point where there are stories in Germany about people sitting in a restaurant having a meal. The prices are increasing as they're sitting there. I think the Reichsmark, which was the currency at the time, I think at one point it was 5 billion to $1. Also, what came along with this inflation was a lot of unemployment, okay? There were just not enough jobs for people. So Hitler said two things. Hitler said, I am going to give everybody a job, and I'm going to do it by rebuilding the military infrastructure of Germany. The second thing that he told people was, the reason you don't have a job is because of the Jews. They have it. Look at what they have. And so he had his scapegoat, and Germany's in dire straits, and all this just had a lot of appeal. About 2.5 years after Hitler comes to power, 1935, they passed the Nuremberg laws in Germany. The Nuremberg laws were laws for the blood and protection of Germany, and they imposed a lot of restrictions on the Jews. One thing that it did was it took away their German citizenship. So if you were Jewish and you were born in Germany, you were no longer a German citizen, you were stateless. There were all kinds of other restrictions, like Jewish legal opinions from Jewish scholars couldn't be quoted in courtrooms. Non-Jewish women under the age of 45 couldn't work in the homes of Jewish families. So my father actually had a nanny that took care of him because my grandmother worked with my grandfather in the jewelry store. She was not Jewish, they had to fire her. She wasn't allowed to work there. So there were just all these really crippling restrictions on Jews, both socially and economically. We're going to listen to my father talk about the Nuremberg laws, but I just want to point out this, I have this up here from the New York Times from 1935. Reich puts laws on Jews in force. I include this I want you to see that the knowledge of this isn't just in Germany, right? The world knows that this is happening, and I think that's important to note. Okay, let's listen to my father talk about Nuremberg laws.
In the meantime, additional decrees came out limiting the movement of Jews. For instance, I recall we couldn't go anymore to the park where we used to go because the benches in the park had signs, no Jews are allowed. It was difficult to travel because hotels had signs, no dogs and no Jews. As a side comment, after World War II, the Germans liked to go to the shore in Holland, and since the Dutch had suffered quite a bit under the German occupation, the hotels on the shore in Holland had signs, no dogs and no Germans.
You can tell he really liked that story, right? He just thought it was so funny. My father loved anything that made fun of Germans and Germany. Like, I don't know, some of you are too young to remember, but some of you clearly do remember, there used to be a TV show on called Hogan's Heroes, and it was a comedy about a concentration camp where, you know, the prisoners are running the concentration camp, really, and it really makes the Germans look like idiots. And my father used to watch that show and just literally like laugh out loud. So the one thing that he said that I think is really important, he said additional decrees were coming all the time. By the time it was said and done, the Germans passed 400 laws and decrees restricting Jewish life in Germany. And that was just at the national level. Municipalities and local governments passed their own decrees in addition to that. Things kind of came to a head in 1938, November 1938, in something called Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht means the night of the broken glass. And what happened was that Germans, both civilians and paramilitary people, they broke the shop windows and ransacked Jewish businesses. They broke down apartment doors and doors of houses where Jewish people lived and trashed all the furniture. They beat people up. They burned down all the synagogues in Germany. And in fact, that picture in the middle, that's the same synagogue that I showed you in an earlier slide. And you can see the smoke coming out of the top. They desecrated all of the Jewish cemeteries in Germany. They actually took the gravestones and they repurposed them to use to pave streets with. So, I mean, it really was, I mean, how disrespectful is that? So then you're actually walking on these gravestones. They arrested about 50,000 Jews. They sent them to concentration camps. My grandfather got arrested. He was sent to Dachau. He was there about 7 or 8 weeks, and then they released him. I will tell you, concentration camps in 1938, they weren't pleasant places, but they were more political prisons. They weren't yet what they became in the 1940s, you know, the death camps. Anyway, let's listen to my father talk a little bit about his experience with Kristallnacht.
We were spared. They never came to our apartment, nor did they destroy the store. And they told my parents later on that since we had a jewelry store and there was a lot of gold in there, that they considered that to be state property, and therefore it was not their intention of destroying it. They picked up my dad, and for several days we didn't really know where he had been sent to. My mother went to the Gestapo office every day to find out what the status was, and I gather they were civil to her, and she finally found out that he had been sent to Dachau.
So like I said, he spent about 7 or 8 weeks there, and then they released him. They sent him home. We talked a little bit about all these decrees that were happening. There was this name change requirement that the Nazis passed where all Jews had to change their name. So if you were a man, you had to add the name Israel to your name. So my grandfather, who was Oscar Schwarz, now became Oscar Israel Schwarz. That was his new legal name. Women had to add the name Sarah to their name. And if you look, that document in the middle is my grandparents' marriage certificate, and the notations on the right, like that box in red, is not, those notations were not part of the original marriage certificate. The Nazis went through the civil register and notated that after the fact in the late 30s. So what that says is that the box in red says that Oscar has now changed his name effective January 1st, 1939 by adding Israel to his name. And the bottom box says that my grandmother has added Sarah to her name. Why did the Germans do this? Okay, obviously this is a lot of work, right? This is expensive, this takes a lot of time. So one reason is obvious, right? If you're Israel or Sarah, you're immediately identified as being Jewish, everybody knows. So that's one reason. Another reason is that it's part of the humiliation and marginalization process of Jews, right? Your name is part of your uniqueness, it's part of your specialness, and this takes that away and makes you just like everybody else. Also, in Jewish tradition, so like names are very special and important to us. So it says in the Old Testament, and I'm paraphrasing this, I don't know the exact verbiage, but it says, you will not forget a person if you don't forget their name. And so what do we do as Jews? Like we name our kids after dead relatives to honor them, right? A name is very special. And so this, kind of taking away the names of Jews and making everybody the same, really drives a dagger through sort of the heart of something that's really important in Jewish culture and traditions. And that was really a big part of what the Nazis did. There was another decree right after Kristallnacht, and it was the decree on the elimination of Jews from German economic life. And it basically forbade Jews from selling goods or services at any establishment of any kind. This letter at the top here is a letter that my grandfather got at the jewelry store, the watchmaker shop. And I've blown out the subject line, and the subject line says, elimination of Jews from German economic life. And the letter goes on to say, the letter came from the equivalent of the mayor's office in Ludwigshafen. The letter goes on to tell him that he has to dissolve the store. He's ordered to do an inventory of everything in the store and has to turn it in by such and such a date. I actually have a copy of the inventory. I don't show it here. It's about 15 pages with each item listed with what my grandfather believed was the value. One thing I want you to note here at the top of the letter, notice the name. It's addressed to Oscar Israel Schwarz, okay? So my grandfather does the inventory. He came out with a value of 7,500 Reichsmarks. This letter at the bottom, obviously they're not going to believe the Jew. This letter at the bottom is the Nazi appraiser who took my grandfather's inventory and valuation, and he did his own, and he said, no, he's wrong, it's really 6,000 Reichsmarks. This is all moot anyway, but the reason I have this letter in here is you'll notice, and I have it kind of blown out, that the letter is signed, before he signs his name, Heil Hitler. I don't know what it was, but I've probably read through thousands of pages of documents across archives in Europe. I had more of a visceral reaction to that than almost anything I've seen. And of course the guy would write that. It makes perfect sense. He was a Nazi. That was the greeting, the closing, Heil Hitler, but it really, really resonated with me. So they have these two conflicting values for the value of the inventory. My grandfather finds a buyer for the store. The Nazis approve him to sell the store to this person. And at the bottom right, in the sales contract is some verbiage. The purchase price is to be paid immediately after approval by the trade office. on the blocked account of the German state bank in Ludwigshafen. What does that mean? It means the buyer paid the money into this account. My grandfather never got the money, right? The Nazis stole it. And this was really typical with Jewish businesses that were seized, right? People paid money, but the Jewish owner never got the money. So I want you to kind of have a sense here of, from just where we started, the level of seriousness is really increasing, right? Like, it starts out, my father talks about name calling, right? Being called Jew pig in school. And then you have legislation, right? You have the Nuremberg laws. And then you have Kristallnacht, you have physical violence and incarceration of Jews. And then you have basically the seizure of Jewish assets, impoverishing them. So everything's getting more serious. It's really clear that Germany's not it's not safe for Jews anymore. Parents are trying to get their kids out of the country. They want to get out themselves, but they want to save the kids first. Arrangements are made for my father to go to France. And he comes home from school one day. We're going to listen to him talk about this in a second. Comes home from school one day. He's 13 years old, and his parents tell him, tomorrow we're putting you on a train to go to France. Okay? It's March of 1939. The war hasn't really started. There is no war in France. Let's listen to my father talk about this.
1939, I was taken to the railroad station, and with a group of 100, maybe 200 kids, we took the train for Paris. When we got to Paris, originally, we were sent to the Rothschild hospital because apparently they had enough rooms and beds available to accommodate everybody, and there we were sorted out and sent to various children hostels. I was sent to a place called Château de la Guette, which was about 50 miles east of Paris. It was, I don't know whether it was owned by the Rothschilds or whether they had rented it, but we were 136 kids, all from Germany and Austria. We were very well taken care of there. In other words, we had nice accommodations. We were adequately fed.
So I just want you to get a sense, imagine, my father talks about all this, and it's, his recall is immaculate, but he's very matter of fact and he's very factual. I mean, he's 13 years old, he doesn't speak French, he's going alone, his parents are staying behind, he doesn't know if he's ever going to see them again, he doesn't know if they're going to get out or what's coming in Germany. I mean, he had to be terrified. And then think about what it must have been like for his parents. They didn't know either. They didn't know if they would get out. I mean, think about putting your 13-year-old kid or grandkid on a train or a plane or a bus and to send them to another country. And I mean, this just had to be just the most devastating experience. So as he talked about, he goes to this place, Château de la Guette. the picture on the bottom left and the top right with the red circle, that's my dad. He's 13, 14 years old there. The picture on the bottom right is from a reunion that the Laguette kids had. I think it was in 1989. My father didn't go, but they sent him pictures, and I will tell you, they didn't all survive. I think all but 10 survived. 10 of the Laguette kids were actually deported to Auschwitz, but all the others, 100 and whatever, did survive the war. On the top left is a class schedule from Laguette. So at Laguette, they were in school. They had a lot of French instruction, and then they had other classes. And I don't know if you can read that, but at the bottom it talks about couture, which is sewing, and ménage, which is housework. And it talks about, in the middle, activité en plein air, so outdoor play. They were getting these kids ready. They were getting them in physical shape, and they were teaching them survival skills because they didn't know what was happening. So about a year later, 14 months later, Germany invades France in May of 1940. And when Germany first invaded France, they didn't occupy the whole country. There was a demarcation line, and that map on the right, you can see that white line, that's the demarcation line. So everything south and east of that is unoccupied France. It's run by the Vichy government, which was, to a large extent, a collaborative government with the German, but it still wasn't the Germans. And then everything to the north of that line is occupied by Germany. Nobody wants to be in German occupation. This is a train platform in 1940, just in Paris, just showing the chaos of people trying to leave. My father, the director of the school where he was in Paris, owned an estate in a town called Poitiers. And he decided Paris isn't safe for all these kids, and he was going to evacuate the school to his farm or his ranch, whatever it was. And we're going to listen to my father leaving Paris.
The director of the school, or the owner of the school, owned an estate near Poitiers, which is sort of halfway between Paris and Bordeaux. When the Germans were basically at the doors of Paris, he decided to evacuate the whole school to Poitiers, and we took the train from Paris to Poitiers. It was quite an experience because everybody was fleeing, and the trains were sort of crowded. I mean, there was barely room to stand, and they were slow, but we finally made it.
So they get to Poitiers. The problem with Poitiers is Poitiers, it's not Paris anymore, but it's still in the German-occupied portion of France. And they stayed there for about 2 months, and the director realized, he said, well, this really isn't any more advantageous or safer than being in Paris. So he took all the kids after 2 months back to Paris. At that point, Laguette was shut down, and they dispersed all of the kids to different parts of France. My father was sent to La Broboule in 1941. La Broboule was in the unoccupied portion of France, so in that sense, it was a lot more desirable. And that was a difficult journey, right? It wasn't easy to get from the occupied portion of France to unoccupied portion of France. A lot of people wanted to do that. People were shot at by the Germans and killed trying to sort of escape to the unoccupied portion of France. My father remembers them that they had papers. He didn't know where they came from or if they were counterfeit or real or what. But anyway, they did get there, and he worked at this hotel in the kitchen as a cook in La Broboule, which makes absolutely no sense if you knew anything about my father. But let's listen to him talk about being in La Broboule.
It was a very harsh winter for us. Food was severely rationed, and the things that were not rationed, just like vegetables, just were not available. Then it was very cold and snowy, lots of snow, very cold in winter, and there wasn't enough coal or wood to heat the place. We had minimal heating in the dining room and in the bedroom and in the classrooms. We had zero heat in the bedrooms, and of course we were constantly hungry. There just wasn't enough to eat. One of the people we were 5 or 6 in each bedroom. One of the people in our room was a very tall and strong guy, and I remember he once went during the day, in the evening rather, into the mountains and into one of the barns, and he stole a 50 kilo bag of oats that were kept there to feed the horses. And he brought it back, and we were eating the oats, which were horse meal, and I remember I had a shoebox, and I filled that with oats, and I kept it under my bed.
I mean, horse meal. I mean, they ate horse meal, right? That was it. You did whatever you had to do to survive. So it's now getting to the end of 1942. Germany now occupies all of France. It's determined it's not safe for these kids anywhere in France. And my father's about to get ready to escape to Switzerland. But before, and we're going to go into that. Before we do that, though, I want to tell you a little bit about what's happening in France while my father is there. So he gets there in March of '39, and he is there until almost the end of 1942. All right, in the middle of that, and you don't get any sense of this listening to my father. He's talking about eating and moving around and leaving Paris and doing this. In May of 1941, they started rounding up Jews in France. So you'd be walking or riding your bicycle, someone would stop you, they'd ask for your papers if you were Jewish. You went to a place called Drancy, which is like a transit center where they aggregated the Jews. The deportations then to Auschwitz started in March of 1942. That was the first deportation convoy to Auschwitz. And while my father, and so in March of 42, he's, like I said, he's still there. He's there almost till the end of 42. These were all the deportations to Auschwitz from France while my father was living there. So you don't get a sense that he doesn't talk about being in hiding and trying not to be found out, but he really was in hiding. Like if he was picked up, they would have been arrested and sent to Auschwitz. So I just, I wanted to add that. So they're now they're going to help these kids escape to Switzerland. My father and 3 friends with counterfeit papers, they take the train to Annemasse. Annemasse is in France, but it's on the border with Switzerland. It's about, I think, 7 miles from Geneva. My father said there were controls everywhere. There were soldiers on the trains checking their papers. He said when they got to Annemasse, you couldn't even get out of the train station without showing your papers. They were met in the train station by, my father called it a guide. I think I actually know who it was. He took them from the train station to a safe house where they hung out till about 2 or 3 in the morning. He then took them to the border. They crossed this little stream, and they were now in Switzerland. Let's listen to my father talk about getting into Switzerland.
Anyhow, we took off our shoes and socks and pulled up our pants, and we got across the barbed wire and that little river, and on the other hand we sat down, we put back our shoes and socks, and at that point that we were already in Switzerland, at the other side of the river was Switzerland. At that point we were caught by a Swiss border guard. As I said, there were 4 of us. He took us to a sort of entry post where we were asked our names and date of birth. We had nothing on us. In other words, no baggage, just the clothes that we were wearing. We had 0 money, neither French nor Swiss. We had no papers whatsoever. So whatever information we gave them, they had to accept at face value. They asked for our date of birth, and 3 of us were born in 25 or 26, and 1 was born in 1927. And they announced that they would not keep children over the age of 16, and the boss asked one of the border guards to take us back to the border and to ship us back across the border into France. They kept the 4th one, who was born in 1927. He took us back to the border. Turn off a second. So he took us back to the border and he said, this is France across that little river, and you need to go back. Geneva is in this direction, and I don't know what you're going to do when I'm on my way back. So we waited till he had gotten back, and then we headed towards Geneva.
So imagine hearing this by the captain or whoever that was that said you have to go back to France. They had, like he said, they had nothing. They had nowhere to go in France. If they go back to France, they are certainly getting picked up by the Germans and most probably deported to Auschwitz. So they take this arduous train ride to Annemasse. They don't get caught. They made it. They cross into Switzerland. I can't imagine what that was like for them hearing they had to go back to France. But they didn't. Obviously, this border guard let them stay. We have words for people. There are all these people that really did wonderful things to save Jews. I don't know, when you came in, you saw the signs on the trees of all those people that are righteous among nations. We call these people upstanders because they did upstanding things, and this border guard really saved their lives. So they hike into Geneva, and they had the name and address of a pastor in Geneva that they knew had helped child refugees. They found him. He gave them breakfast. My father said he and his friends had no idea that there was this much food anywhere in the world, right? It was really hard in France. He gave them money to take the tram, told them to go to the police station and tell them that you're 15 years old, because that was the cutoff to stay in Switzerland if you were a child. And that's what they did. The child refugee program in Switzerland, for whatever reason, was administered by the police. Just one word about this hike into Geneva, these 7 miles that they hiked. It's the end of 1942. It's the winter. It's cold. It's snowy. It's wet. These are the Swiss Alps that they're hiking through, right? These are rugged mountains. This hike into Geneva, this wasn't The Sound of Music, okay? This was rough. So my father ended up in Switzerland. He was in Switzerland until the end of the war. He ended up living in, I think, 10 different places. They kept moving him around to different children's homes where he worked, in the kitchen, which again made no sense, but he had this experience in France working as kind of a cook, so that's what they did. But everywhere he went, even though he was safe in Switzerland, right? He was not going to be deported to a camp. He still was not a citizen. He was a refugee, and his life wasn't easy. Like, he had all these restrictions about what he could do. He had a curfew. He couldn't leave the city without getting the permission from the police. Anytime he changed jobs, they had to get the approval of the police department. And he had this one job at this one children's home, and they paid him money. Half the money went to him, half the money went into an account that he had to write to the police, write letters to the police to get permission to get some of that money for whatever, to buy clothes or whatever he wanted to do with it. But this was a letter that was written by one of the children's homes he was working at. So he's there, and this letter says, unfortunately, Schwarz can only operate in the kitchen to a very limited extent. The young man is so morbid with his nerves, it is not possible for him to attentively and cautiously provide the rather exhausting work of a cook. And I put this in here because it was really the only thing that I saw in all the documents that I have that really talked about his state of mind and how traumatic this experience was and how this had to have affected him. But they told the police further on in the letter, but he's a nice kid and he's intelligent and we want to keep him, and can we have permission to keep him, but we're going to cut his salary from this to this. And they allowed him to stay. And like I said, I think all in all, he lived in about 10 different places in Switzerland. His parents, meanwhile, about 2 or 3 months after they sent my father out of Germany and sent him to France, they got out. They went to England. And so the whole time my father is moving around France and then living in Switzerland, his parents are in England. And they're able to write letters to each other. There are no phone calls. You're not getting on a plane during the war and flying to visit each other, but they could send letters. There was only about, I think, a 6-month period where my grandparents had lost touch with my father. So the war ends, and my father, rather than, you'd think the war would end and my father would go to England and reunite with his parents, right? He left them when he was 13. He's now 19 years old. He hasn't seen them in 6 years. Can you imagine, like, not seeing your kid from 13 to 19? But he doesn't go to England to reunite with his parents. He goes to Palestine. It's not yet Israel. It doesn't become Israel until 1948. And he worked on a kibbutz. I don't know if you know what a kibbutz is. A kibbutz is kind of like, at the time they were all agricultural communes, okay? The kibbutz, my father, they're very, very, they've changed now. Now they have kibbutzim in technology and all sorts of things. And I think they're more capitalist. But at the time, very, very socialist. You couldn't own anything. My father, he spent 9 months there. He hated it. His parents sent him airmail stamps so he could write them letters via airmail, and the kibbutz confiscated them. They said, you can't own that. Anyway, so he didn't like it at all. So he spent about 9 months there till the middle of 1946, and then he finally goes to England and reunites with his parents in London. He lived in London for 2 years until 1948. He had various jobs. He learned English. He didn't speak any English at the time. And, there we go. And then he came to America. He came to New York, and he came alone. He came first. He got an apartment in, I don't know if you know New York at all, in Washington Heights, which is kind of in northern Manhattan. There were a lot of immigrants living there at the time. He got an apartment, he got settled, and then his parents came over afterwards to join him. The document at the top right is the ship manifest of my father went sailing from Liverpool to New York in 1948. And that card at the bottom is from the Naturalization Service when he became an American citizen. My father built a great life for himself and his family here. He was a chemical importer. They had 2 kids, my brother and I. My brother's actually sitting here in the front row. I have 2 kids. I now have a grandson. And these are just some pictures of the family. That's the top left is a picture of me. I was 13 years old. That's my bar mitzvah. That's my father in the top middle holding, I think it's my son as a newborn. And you can see my kids on the bottom left. That's kind of, well, that picture's probably 5 or 6 years old, but that's kind of what they are now. In the bottom middle, that's my son at his wedding, and the bottom right is my grandson, my son's son, who we just had a 1-year birthday party for him yesterday, which was really great. And so saving my father, there are now 5 of us that wouldn't be here if my father hadn't survived. So I think the story kind of has a happy ending. For me, there's a lot of hopefulness in his story. When things, for me, you know, we all hit tough stretches in our lives, and for me, knowing the story and the experience that my father had, when things got tough for me, I could reflect back and say, you know what, this is never going to be as hard as what my father went through. And it kind of gave me strength and hope, and that things can turn out. I just have one more thing to say, and then I'll take some questions. When Greg introduced me, he talked a little bit about the Ackerman Center. I just want to tell you a little bit about it. It's a Holocaust Studies Center. It's at the University of Texas at Dallas. I'm on the board there, I don't know, 8 years. Is it 8? Something like that. Anyway, I've been on the board for 8 years. The Ackerman Center there's only 2 centers like that at universities across the country that are specifically, like lots of universities teach Jewish studies and Holocaust courses, but to have a center that's 100% dedicated to the teaching of the Holocaust is somewhat unique. We have 5 full-time professors, and it's really a vibrant and robust place. And I just want to invite you, we have a lot of things going on. We have a lot of lectures. Our professors speak regularly. We bring in speakers, Holocaust scholars from from outside the university to speak. So if you're interested in this topic, I invite you to, to come and see what our programming is all about. There's no charge for any of the events, and they're all open to the public. We also sponsor something called, it's called the Annual Scholars Conference, and it's probably the preeminent Holocaust event in academia. And we have professors and researchers that come in from all over the world to present their papers and their articles. It's every year in March. And I want to tell you that Gateway Church has been a very generous supporter of the Ackerman Center and the Annual Scholars Conference. So anyway, that's all I have. Thank you so much for coming, and I don't know what the format is for questions, but if you have any, I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
I have a question. Am I on? I'm on.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the first thing I want to say is thank you for sharing that testimony. Really, you really honored your father in that testimony, and I was touched. So did your father talk, as you were growing up, did your father talk a lot about his experience, or at what age did he begin to share his story with you and your brother?
So my father did talk about it. A couple of things about that. He did talk about it. I kind of want to say that I maybe was about 8 when he first started talking about it, and I couldn't hear enough of it. It was that we used to, my father, so my grandparents lived about 45 minutes from us, and my father used to go almost every Sunday to have lunch with them, and sometimes my brother and I would go, sometimes we wouldn't. And I remember being in the car with my father and saying, "Dad, tell me that story again, tell me that story." I just couldn't hear it enough. What's really interesting about it, I don't know, you watch him, and my father is very matter of fact, right? Talks about, again, his recall's immaculate. He talks about this and that. There's kind of there's not a lot of emotion in what he talks about in what had to be a very, very emotional experience. And I don't know, I was always looking for that, because for me it's conspicuous by its absence. And I will tell you, so when I got this video testimony from my father, the format was I would record him, and then I would stop him, and I'd sit down with him, and I would ask him questions about what he just talked about. And I recorded the questions, and then he would continue talking. I really wanted to know about when he reunited with his parents in London, right? He hadn't seen them from 13 years old to 20, right? He left kind of a boy, and now he's a young man. So, okay, Dad, so it went something like this. Dad, how'd you get to London? He's in Palestine. He took a ship to Marseille, and then the train, okay. So wait, you arrived in London by train? Yes. Okay. Did your parents know when you were coming? Yes. Did they know what train you were on? Yes. Were they there at the station to meet you? Yes, they were there. Did they know, and where were they? Were they in the waiting room? Were they on the platform? Where were they? He said, no, they were on the platform. I said, okay, so you get off the train, and did you recognize them immediately? Yes, I saw them. Okay, so you go over and you see them, and did you hug them? Like, did you cry? Did your mother cry? I don't remember. From a man who remembered everything, and it kind of broke my heart a little bit, because I'm sure he has suffered some kind of PTSD, and maybe they didn't know about that then. But anyway, for me, that's sort of the one thing that's kind of missing that had to be there.
Thank you so much for this great story. I'd love to watch all 5 hours of your dad's testimony. I had 2 simple questions. One is Dachauer. Why did they release, I believe it was your grandfather, in that original internment? And then 2, how did they connect from your grandparents fled to England, and then your dad's in Switzerland, and during all that chaos, how did they connect? I mean, there's no internet, there's no phones, things like that.
Okay, so the first question was about
Dachau. Just a simple question. Why did they release him from Dachau?
Why they released him?
Yeah.
So, right, because by the 1940s, they didn't release, no one got out of concentration camps, right? But in 1938, the concentration camps were different. They were more political prisons for undesirables than anything else. You know, the extermination program hadn't started yet. The death camps didn't exist yet. Auschwitz didn't become operational until 1942, like 4 years later. So it was just, again, they were prisons for the undesirables. And I don't think they ever meant to keep them locked up forever. So, in terms of how they stayed in touch, they were able to write letters. My father knew there was mail, except for about 6 months when they lost touch. But my father knew where his parents were living in London. And again, for most of the time, you know, my father moved around France. He lived in 10 different places his 3.5 years in France, which is probably one of the reasons he survived, right? You look at, right, Anne Frank didn't move around, right? She was in one place. But, and so they knew where he was, and they were able, you're right, there was no internet, there were no phone calls, couldn't make an international call, but they could send letters, and they stayed in touch that way.
Ron, do you know if there were other members of your family that did not survive the war that were the victims of the Holocaust?
As far as I don't know too much. My father was an only child, okay? So it was not a big family, so it's not like he had cousins. There were some kids of his biological father that I've sort of done some research and tried to connect with them, and from what I could tell, they all survived. So I really don't know, you know, fortunately, that anybody else in his family, you know, perished in the camps. I do know that 10 of the Laguette kids did, but that's not family.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, he's got the mic, so.
I was wanting to ask what your father would think about orphans and how they went through things and are going through things.
I'm sorry, what my father would think about what?
Like some orphans that were in the Holocaust that went through it and they didn't have their parents, what he would have told them maybe to encourage them.
You know, that's a good question. I can only guess. I don't know. Obviously, there were friends of his who did lose their parents. But again, he and I never talked about it. I'd like to think he was supportive and empathic, but I never had the conversation with him.
Hi. As you guys were growing up, or even after the war, and then Germany is East Germany, but Frankfurt was in West Germany. Was there ever time that your dad or his parents went back after the war and had any time with, like, coming back to home in a way, or coming back where they were raised? And did they take you and your brother?
So my father used to go to Germany all the time on business. He was happy to go there. He was not, you know, there are a lot of American Jews that won't buy German cars and all that. My father thought that was all nonsense. He had German cars. He went to Germany all the time. He used to say, oh, I can't speak German anymore. My German's not any good. He really preferred speaking French. So yes, he went back all the time. I do know he went once to Ludwigshafen. They never took my brother or I, but we both have been there since he died. So yeah, I wish we had, there's a lot I wish we had done together regarding his story, you know. I was just so happy to get all the video. but then you start digging and you do research and, you know, oh my God, I have so many more questions.
Cliff, you have to be sitting. Blame it on my wife. She likes to sit in the back. Two questions. One is, did you know your grandparents? And two is, how did they evacuate and get to London?
Did I know yes, I knew my grandparents. They lived in New York. They lived until, I don't know, I was about 20. And so, yes, I did know them. My grandmother was a really warm, loving, great woman, and my grandfather was he was good, and he was good to us, but he was a bit stoic. I never really got the story about how they got out. I asked my father. He said that when the jewelry store was taken, you know, that my grandfather, you know, they put some stuff in their pockets and that they used that to bribe their way out of Germany. So I don't know much about the journey to England. I do know they went from Germany to Brussels and then to England. And really all I know was my father saying that he believed they just bribed their way out.
Thank you so much for sharing your story and your family story. I was wondering, what is one thing from your upbringing and from like having such close historical relation with all of this? What is one thing you wish people who don't have that connection understood more?
You know, that's a really good question. I don't know. I have hundreds of pages of documents at my house that I've been through, and I want to show you every single one of them, and it kind of hurts me that I can't. I think the one thing that I would say, there were two things. Obviously, it's all very interesting when you start getting these documents about your parents and your grandparents, but the two things that really resonated with me, one was the Heil Hitler letter, and the other was, so when my father was in Switzerland, like anything he wanted to do, he had to write a letter to the police and get permission. So I have copies of all these letters, and they're in his handwriting, and they're applications that he filled out and he signed, and it's his signature. They're all from the 1940s. And when I saw that, I also had kind of a visceral reaction to that. And that's really something that I wanted to share, just how that really affected me, to see something that he wrote, you know, whatever, 80 years ago, you know, and how that, and I could tell, I mean, it's his handwriting, it's distinct, so. Thank you all very much. I think we're...
I really, really want to thank you. This evening, you reminded everyone really well that this is a very personal story. I think sometimes we think, you know, 6 million, 6 candles, but it's a personal story. And this is the risk of, when you forget the past, of repeating it again. And if there's one thing I think we can really see, just turn on the news today, and you will be reminded that we are repeating it again in the Ukraine. Unbelievable. It's happening right now. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
It struck me today, I don't know why I never thought of this before today, but there's 2 events on the calendar. I thought of that, but you've got Yom HaShoah, the day of the catastrophe. That's the 27th day of the month of Nisan on the Hebrew calendar, biblical calendar. And then you've got January 27th, which is Holocaust Remembrance Day. This day was set up by the UN. This day was set up by Israel. The thought came to me today, the calendar, by virtue of the fact that there's 2 different events like this, pretty much ensures that Jewish people are going to be more interested in Yom HaShoah, because it's on the biblical calendar, it's when Israel remembers it, and the rest of the world is going to remember it on January 27th. Here's the problem. Over time, which one are the Jewish people going to remember? Which one are the Jewish people not going to? They're going to move away from this day. The people who are most interested in the event are going to become less and less engaged in the day that is set by the UN as the International Holocaust Day. It's almost built into the calendar to have a situation where in time the event will be forgotten. Can you see that? Does that make sense, what I just said? It's just built into it, because that day is the day that the UN is established. This day is the day that Israel. And I don't know the history as to why there's the 2 different, I don't know that. The 27th day of the month of Nisan is the first day or the 27th day of the first month in the biblical calendar. January 27th is the first month. So there's obviously a correlation. But it just strikes me. And as I listen to the story and I watch the map of France being piecemealed, and the original intention was to not take over all of France, doesn't that sound like what's happening right now? We're just going to take over this part of Ukraine. And that's how World War II got started. Hitler said, give us Czechoslovakia. We'll leave everybody else alone. I want to encourage you, if you're interested in studying this, and I know you're here tonight, so you are interested, the Ackerman Center is a great resource. The Scholars Conference is a great resource. You can get a bachelor's, master's, or doctorate level degree there with a certificate in Holocaust Studies. Some of you will also be interested to know that the King's University, TKU, has a master's degree now in practical theology with the concentration in Jewish advocacy and anti-Semitism. So you could study it at the King's as well. I really want to thank this campus, Pastor Steve and Tracy and Caroline, and just everybody at this campus who helped us to who helped this event to come together. And finally, one other thing that has just recently come to pass. You probably know that we have an event every week on Saturdays. It's during the 4 o'clock service at South Lake. It's called Havdalah, but really what we really call it now is we just call it Jewish Insights into the Psalms, and I teach on that every Saturday at 4 o'clock. This Saturday we're going to do something different because there's a Holocaust survivor from Fort Worth, and so she has offered to come talk at Havdalah. I said, how long do you want? I offered to give her all the time she wanted, but all she wants is 15 minutes. So it'll still be a normal. She wants me to talk about anti-Semitism the rest of the time. So if you would like to come to that, we'd love to have you. It'll be 4 o'clock this Saturday, and you can watch it online as well. Just Jewish@gatewaypeople.com, and you can request the Zoom link, and you can watch it online. But we'd love to have you. Thank you for coming, and may the Lord bless each and every one of you. And we can fellowship out in the foyer. God, we just thank you for your protection, for your people, and for all people, especially, Lord, for the people of Ukraine today. In your name we pray. Amen. Thank you for coming.